What is going on, everybody? This is Brandon. Welcome back to Comics Kings, or welcome if this is your first time. Thank you guys so much for your support that you have shown the channel lately. Today's a very special episode of Creator's Corner. We are joined by one of my favorite people ever in the Bronze Age of comics throughout the 80s. You guys know him from New Mutants, Kraven's Last Hunt, a bunch of Captain America, a bunch of Spider-Man. Let's all welcome Bob McLeod to the channel. Thank you so much for being here today, sir.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
No problem, man. And as always, chat, if you guys have a question for Bob, make sure you guys ask it because we will read it aloud on the show. I like to do that because a lot of times we can't go to cons, especially in the pandemic. So make sure you guys do ask a question. Should you have one, do not be shy. Also, remember to hit that thumbs up, like the video. Gives us a little bit of help. Subscribe if you are new. Bob, quick question for you. What actually got you into this hobby, into drawing, into all the different fandoms we're seeing today?
I actually never intended to be a comic book artist. I had a friend when I was working at a grocery store as a teenager who found out I could draw, and he was a big Marvel Comics fan. And he said, "Oh, you got to work for Marvel." And I had never even really thought about working in comics. I wanted to work for Mad Magazine, actually, or have my own newspaper comic strip. I was much more into the humor comics than the superheroes and dramatic comics. The only comic I read really regularly was Superman and the whole Superman family of comics. And then Archie comics. My sister would buy Archie comics and I would buy Superman, and we'd swap off. But I don't know why. I never really considered getting into comic books until that guy suggested it. And I had to start my career somewhere, so I thought I'd give comics a try. So naive. I assumed I'd just easily get into the business and use that as a stepping stone to move on from there.
There you go. And did you have like a portfolio that you did? Like, did you go to a con, or did you just walk up to the Marvel box and say, "Here you guys go, check me out"?
No, I went to the. It was 1973, I think, 1974, the New York Comic Con. I'm from Tampa, Florida, so I sold my car to finance a trip up to New York to try to start my career doing something. I thought I'd actually do some advertising. So I went to some ad agencies first, got nowhere there, couldn't get any good response from them. So then I went to the New York Comic Con, and actually just happened by random chance to run into a guy that was in my high school art class in Tampa, Pat Broderick. And Pat was trying to get into the DC apprenticeship program at the time. And so he and I both tried out for that, and he got in and I did not. And but we ended up being roommates for a short time.
So that probably made you work twice as harder to get in. Who would you say, other than Pat, was probably like your biggest influence, your biggest mentor once you actually made it into Marvel or DC?
Well, I was, like I say, I was into like Mad Magazine type stuff. So my first work at Marvel was for their Crazy magazine, doing satires of movies and humor stuff. But I realized that, everything was really all about the superheroes and the more dramatic comics rather than the humor. Everybody I met didn't care that much about humor and was much more into the other comics. And so I figured out, well, I better learn how to do this if I'm going to have a career. So I started looking at all the comics, and my favorites, the guys I thought were the best in the business, were John Buscema and Neil Adams. And so they're the main two artists that I studied. I studied like John for his storytelling, his composition, his anatomy, the way he posed his figures. And then I liked the way Neil rendered everything. So I was studying him more as an inker than a penciler, actually. But just his realism, I thought was really attractive. I thought he had a really attractive style.
Right.
So those were the two main guys.
Right. Yeah, Neil was probably one of my all-time favorites. I think the way like Neil was able to capture space, especially with Batman and Green Lantern, of course. I think, especially with characters that are meant to fit into such tight panels, he was able to like expand everything and just reinvigorate how we know those characters. And John was just solid, man. He was probably I would say the most solid artist in his time period. He didn't really do anything like Neil Adams that was like big, bold, reaching, but everything was solid, perfect. Like you couldn't ask for two better people to look up to, man. What was
Yeah,
probably the? Oh, I'm sorry.
John wasn't very flashy, but like I say, it was really solid stuff. And
Right,
for me, trying to learn storytelling, visual storytelling, and how to create scenes, panel, what angles to use, how to pose the figures and everything. I thought he was the best guy to study. And of course, that book came out around the same time, How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, that Stan wrote and he illustrated. So I used that book a little bit.
right,
So he was a big help.
right. And Stan and John probably they had a great relationship, especially with Silver Surfer. You're drawing Stan Lee's favorite character, hands down. Obviously he's gonna love him to death, but
Yeah.
let's talk about how your career got started with New Mutants. How did that project kind of land in your lap? Going with that.
Well, my career started off as an inker mainly.
Right.
After I moved on from the humor stuff, my inking career took off, and I was doing an awful lot of inking, but I still was having trouble getting the editors to give me any penciling work. They thought my penciling was a little too stiff, and I just didn't know quite how to do the dramatic comics the way they wanted them done. So I just kept studying and studying the penciling while I was making a living as an inker, and it took me like 5 years, from 74 till around 79, before I finally got a Spider-Man script from the editors. And that was my first penciling job, was Marvel Team Up number 86 with Spider-Man and the Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yes.
And then I started doing various fill-in issues. I did some more Spider-Man. I think I did a Moon Knight or whatever. And then X-Men needed a fill-in. Jim Sherman had started an issue of X-Men and couldn't finish it for some reason. I'm not sure why he had to leave, but he had just started laying out some of the pages, and they needed somebody to finish that issue up. So they got me to pencil the rest of that issue and ink a couple pages, and then they liked what I did on that, so they asked me to do the next issue as well, X-Men 152, and they liked what I did on that, and so they actually offered me the job of being the regular penciler on the X-Men, and I really wanted to draw the X-Men. I was having a good time, and who wouldn't want to draw the X-Men, right? So
Right.
I was excited about that, but then they said, we're also going to do this spinoff of the X-Men. We haven't got a title yet, but it's going to be a younger group of X-Men type mutants, and you could be co-creator on that job if you'd rather do that. And that was a really tough decision, because X-Men was a proven quantity. That was going to be a good series to put my name on and establish myself as a penciler on. And then the new book, we didn't know if it was going to be a flop. We didn't know if anybody was going to want these New Mutants. It was a big gamble, but I figured, when am I going to get a chance to be a co-creator again? So I better jump on this. And plus, they said I would have plenty of time. It wasn't scheduled, and I could do my absolute best work on it.
Right, and that definitely showed going through this issue the past few days. We were talking about realism a little bit before with Neil Adams, and there was a lot of inspiration from Neil Adams in this book. Like we were talking about, the way that you managed space in this book was very much a reflection in Neil Adams. Because you had that time, and the format was a little bit different. Was it easier for you to kind of capture that? Was that your goal?
Well, I was very influenced by Neil, and trying to emulate the look of his style and the way that Tom Palmer was inking John Buscema and Neil. So I was really going for that look as much as I could. But you know, everybody's an individual, and I'm not Neil Adams or John Buscema, so my own style kind of came through in spite of me trying to emulate their styles. And so I was kind of in the process of developing my own pencil style on that series.
Right, 100%. And did you influence the costume designs, or was this something that Chris already had in mind for New Mutants, or did you really
No,
take all the costumes and run with them?
yeah, that was a big discussion we had. Were they going to have individual costumes, or were they going to have a school uniform? And what might their costumes look like? So I did some sketches with them in their own costumes. And we just decided they're going to be students in Xavier School. They should have a school uniform instead. Why would they have costumes? So we wanted to have some kind of school uniform. And the whole idea of the book was kind of going back to the original concept of the X-Men, which was teenage superheroes. And so these were younger teenagers, and we kind of liked the old black and yellow X-Men uniforms. So we just kind of did a riff on them, and you know, used that as our
Right.
guide.
Right. That first class X-Men is 100 is perfect, especially for this group of mutants. And let's dive into some of the characters that you introduced. We had Karma, who is Vietnamese. We have Ron, who's Scottish, which is Wolfspan. We have Daniel Moonstar, who is a Native American, and then we have Cannonball, who is he's from Kentucky, and then we have Sunspot, who is Brazilian. Now, I think the whole point of Chris Claremont, or a lot of his career, was also bringing in a lot of characters from all over the world, so kids could have something to look up to. Now, that's safe to say here, did you have any influence on like where these characters are coming from, their background?
No, Chris had all that kind of done before they brought me on board. It wasn't quite nailed down yet exactly who was going to be on the team. He had a couple other characters that he might have brought in. So we talked about which characters we wanted to use, and he originally was thinking that the werewolf character Rain would be Iranian, and I did a sketch of her as an Iranian character, and then he decided to make her Scottish instead. So you know, we were going through changes like that, and was Sunspot going to get big like the Hulk when he used his powers, or was he going to stay little? So I did a sketch of him, you know, really big and muscular like the Hulk. You know, was Sam going to be muscular? What was he going to look like? And I kind of like the idea of Cannonball being kind of lanky and kind of uncomfortable in his clothes and just unsure of himself and his body. So you know, we went through, I did some sketches, and we went through some different ideas about how they might look, and talked about like how many characters were going to be in the book, for example. And I suggested, well, let's have more females than males in the group, because every other team up to that time would have like a token female or something. And I like drawing girls, and Chris likes writing girls. So he said, sure, yeah, good idea. And we ended up with the more females than males.
Right. You had three versus the two, and then later on you had Magic coming in, but that was long after you were
It was
doing the
after I
book.
left. Yeah.
Right. Did you know that she was going to be coming on, because she first appeared there while all this was coming in?
Yeah, Ileana was in issue 3, was it, or 2 or 3?
Yeah, she
She
was
made
like
an
briefly
appearance.
mentioned.
Yeah, with Mora. So I knew she was coming in. Chris said she was going to be joining the team later on. Yeah, but I left the book before they actually brought her in as Magic.
Right. And which character did you have kind of like the most fun drawing or renditioning or growing?
I mean, Cannonball I had a lot of fun with, because he's not your typical, or at least when I was drawing him, he wasn't your typical superhero. Like I said, I made him kind of awkward looking
Right.
with his big ears, and his pants were too short, and just trying to make him. I tried to make all of them look like teenagers instead of superheroes. So I had a lot of fun with him, and I mean, all of them were fun to draw. I liked the way Danny Moonstar looked. It was fun drawing Rain. I tried to make her look really young and innocent, and Sunspot kind of like a braggart, so kind of giving him an attitude. So I had fun with all of them.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about Cannonball because his story was a little bit. It was a little weird. His father, his father had dreams for him to go D1 in college, be like this big person, have a future, but pushed him to also work to provide for the family. Right. And then his mutant powers came about because his employer, which he was working in a factory, he was like doing a lot of mining. His employer was getting trapped and he pushed him out. In your mind, how did you kind of envision Cannonballs or Sam's struggle? Because it was a lot of these, all of these mutants had struggles, but how did you really think about his going into this book, going into everything?
Well, if you remember in the graphic novel, Sam was working in the coal mine when
Right,
his powers manifested, and he actually went to work for the bad guys to begin with.
right,
He didn't know about Xavier, and he got sucked into working for the bad guys and wasn't sure, about what his place would be and who these other characters were that he was supposed to be capturing and fighting against. And so then he, at the end of the graphic novel, ends up kind of switching sides and
right,
becoming one of the team. But his role was really kind of up in the air at the time. They were starting out, and then they didn't exactly have a team leader early on in the first issues that I was working on. Um, Danny Moonstar kind of had a really strong personality, and she kind of was I guess, kind of the leader for a while. Sunspot also was a pretty strong personality, so
right.
there was, some friction among the characters, which is always makes for a good story. But it took a while for Cannonball to kind of come into his own and learn how to use his powers and kind of find himself.
Right. His backstory in the sense that he was brainwashed almost or told to fight for one team, but really fighting against the people that he could relate to. Once he saw the people that, oh crap, I'm actually on the supposed to be fighting with these guys instead of against him. It was almost like he opened the door for himself. And then when he actually went to the X Mansion, he was part of the team, showed up in that nice blue suit, um, which was pretty dope. I always thought the team leader from reading just Marvel Team 100 was Karma, just because we were really introduced to her struggle first, or at least in the omnibus, that's like the reading order that it was going in, was supposed to be Karma, and her character was so powerful, and her bringing in her brother and his memories was really methodical with the whole yin and yang, because she has a great sense of kind of that the balance of life. I thought she was the leader, especially kind of in the first issue, how she kind of coordinated everything. She was the one at the end of the day making a lot of the hard shots, while Danielle, she was kind of a little bit more passively aggressive in some cases, or she flat
Mhm.
out said really no, which is completely understandable with her situation.
Yeah, Karma, they killed her off pretty early in the series. I don't remember doing a lot with Karma. I was, she was around before the New Mutants got together. So she was already established. She wasn't one of the ones that I created. And I was much more concerned with kind of getting my characters the way I wanted them. And you got to remember, too, this was my first penciling series. I had just started penciling a couple years before and was still kind of learning uh, how I wanted to do things. So I was really focused much more on the art than the story. So I would take Chris's plots and just be consumed with how I was going to show everything, how I was going to present everything, how I was going to make them what they were doing visually. So I really even wasn't paying that much attention to what Chris was doing with the writing. I was so focused on the art.
So when you were doing Danielle, who her power is a little tricky because she can make you feel your worst nightmare. She can make you see it in your mind. How were you kind of able to display that? Because it didn't feel like she was telepathic, like doing what Charles Xavier does, and his mind just pops up halfway through the page, and boom, there he is. You know, he's like in everyone's head because his hands are always right here. How did you really make her powers stand out to the reader?
Well, that was an issue that we talked about because we didn't want her to just be another Xavier. You know, we wanted to try to make her using her powers look different than Xavier did when he was using his, because they both had mind powers. So we did in the graphic novel, we did a lot of color holds, this was way before computers, you know, so we didn't have all the special effects that you can do with Photoshop and the different digital programs. What we had to do was I would draw these manifestations of her power on a separate sheet of paper and an overlay, either a plastic acetate overlay or another solid sheet of paper that would be printed separately in a color. Instead of black line, you'd have a colored line. But I actually had to draw all of those on a separate sheet of paper.
That's I think that's the first time I've ever heard somebody like mention they had to draw some things on a different sheet of paper and overlay it, especially like from the Bronze Age or like a late Bronze Age going forward. What do you think is probably the biggest reason why she's so against Charles? Is it because her powers are so similar, or because you know, she because of how she was brought in to the New Mutants?
I'm not sure how to answer that. You know, we were just trying to do, this was all kind of new for me, and Chris was trying to make this a different book than the X-Men. So we were just trying to come up with things that hadn't been done with the X-Men that we could make them distinctive. Just try to make the book its own, you know, entity.
Right. And then going forward, right? Because Rain was always my favorite going forward. I think like when I started reading X-Men, she was on the Astonishing team. So when I went back to reading Mutants, I guess she was like the first character. I was like, I know that person. I wasn't exactly the biggest fan of Magic because I didn't really like the way people wrote her, other than Claremont. But Rain, for me, she was always very heartfelt, and she kind of had like that struggle of power. I don't know if you're a Harry Potter fan, but
Oh yeah.
I always liked Remus Lupin and kind of how he was able to balance the two lives. How would you kind of characterize Rain and her role in the New Mutants?
Well, when I was working on the book, you know, she was still very. I don't know too much about what they did after I left the book because I quit reading the series when I left. But you know, she had that religious upbringing and was thinking that her power was evil and that she was somehow cursed and was not at all happy being able to become a wolf. So she had this really religious conflict going on when I was working on the book, and just was kind of ashamed that she wasn't normal.
Right. I believe it was issue 2. It was either in 2 or 3. When Danielle was in the garden and they were having that moment before they left with Stevie. Rain said she actually wished that she could be a permanent werewolf and just be away from all the stress. I guess that was because she was in a better environment where there were other people that were kind of similar to her.
Mm-hmm.
Is that pretty safe to say?
Yeah, I think so. You know, is very a lot of stress, a lot of emotional turmoil going on as a human, but as a wolf, she could just be an animal with following her instincts and a much simpler existence.
Right. And then obviously like within the first few issues, while being in the danger room, we also saw them having a lot of character moments. But Danielle, of course, she was the outcast, and she went back into the danger room by herself and brought out the brood.
Yeah.
Was that like an essential part? Was that like essential play? Because I know Claremont was really playing around with the brood at that time, and that was like one of the Queen's first few appearances in one of her bigger roles. But she was like kind of a astral projection that was haunting everyone.
Yeah. Um, he had to come up with some kind of conflict. So the danger room was one thing, but then they had to be having some kind of conflict, some kind of problems, and he was using the brood in the X-Men, and it just seemed um, that they were around and they would run into them, and it would be an issue with the New Mutants.
Right.
So it seemed like a good way to go. Um, we wanted something really dramatic, and I actually really enjoyed drawing that issue where Danny is in the danger room and then passes out, and then she gets in with the Queen and everything. It was fun to draw.
Yeah, and was she your favorite person to play around with?
She was fun. Yeah, I enjoyed her storyline, everything that she did. But like I said, I enjoyed working with all of them. That whole sequence where they were all in the danger room, kind of trying to learn to use their powers, was a lot of fun to draw. Um, and then if I had stayed on the book, I think I would have tried to encourage Chris to keep them in school longer as students, and not push them out into the outer world, becoming more typical superheroes quite so fast. And like I say, I didn't read a lot of the stories that they did after I left the series, so maybe he did that more than I'm aware of. Um, but I think it would have been um, more interesting to me to keep them uh, more as students instead of fighting, super bad people.
Right. I definitely agree. Mostly because in the first few issues that I read, in the danger room and even in learning, you really got more of their personalities. Which is definitely like how you want to build a team. I know in his Giant Size X-Men, and with that new team, with the new X-Men, they were automatically thrown into the fire, and Chris was trying to tell their origin stories through flashbacks. But because their origins were so in the now, I think it definitely would have worked for them to be in school a little bit longer, just so the readers could retain who they were a little bit more. 100%. A Sunspot, a character we really have not talked about too much, being a soccer player, having that big eruption, not really pun intended there. But how did you really resonate with him and get him to be the character that he is today?
Well, he was fun. I tried to make them all so individual. So he was supposed to be a little short, feisty guy, as opposed to Sam, who was supposed to be much taller. In later miniseries and later artists coming on the book, they started looking more and more similar. But I tried to make them all very distinctive looking. And so he was not supposed to be like African American. He's Brazilian and half white. His mother is white and his dad is Brazilian. So I didn't want to give him kinky hair. I wanted him to have more like curly hair, wavy curly
Right.
hair. Um, and it's always fun to draw characters with darker skin because you can do more dramatic lighting on them. It's an easier skin tone to work with, so I was enjoying that. But just the fact that he's this little guy with kind of a chip on his shoulder and thinks he's so special, he was always fun to draw.
100%, man. And Sunspot kind of felt like he had the weight of the world kind of on his shoulders, especially when the Sentinels attacked them in the mall. It really, it felt like he was responsible. He felt like, yeah, I'm responsible. I got to get rid of him. Then when Cannonball got captured, he was really trying to take the reins and bring them down, but there are like 3 Sentinels around him. But it was a different kind of rendition of the Sentinels that were drawn at the time. If you want to talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, they offered to let me make up my own Sentinels. The original idea, I think, of the Sentinels was that there'd be a series of them. They wouldn't always just be looking the same. So there were different series that would look a little different. So they told me I could design my own Sentinels. So I did a sketch of what I thought the new Sentinels might look like, and they liked it and approved it. So I went ahead with that, just deliberately trying to make them so they were recognizable as Sentinels, but still look pretty different from the original ones. And I never really liked the pink on the Sentinels. I thought pink's not really a dynamic color. So I went with the gray and blue for mine.
There you go. Yeah, I always kind of saw Sentinels kind of like a not like a xenomorph from Alien, and kind of like how each time they are redone or done again, they keep getting like kind of upgraded, for
Yeah.
lack of a better word. So it was definitely a cool little Easter egg that a lot of people will look over. So you're constantly talking about how you left the book, and whenever I do talk to an artist, once they leave a book, they're like, "Yeah, I never read it again," or like a creator, like when I spoke to Bob Layton, he's like, "I never read Iron Man after I left the book. I don't know, I don't care. I did what I had to do." But why did you end up leaving New Mutants?
I was rushed on the series from the moment I got on it. Really, we were going to have it as a regular comic book series, and there was no deadline. And I got about I don't know 5 pages into it, and they were starting up the graphic novel line at the time, and they were looking for projects to turn into graphic novels. And so, hey, it was perfect timing. They said, let's make the New Mutants into a graphic novel. And I said, well, sure, great. I'd love to do a graphic novel. But the graphic novels had a set schedule that was different from the comic books. And suddenly, instead of having a lot of time to do my best work, I was behind schedule all of a sudden. And I had not 20 pages to do, but more like 50 pages to do. And so I had to just draw as fast as I could draw. The graphic novel was some of the fastest work I've ever done. And again, it was my first regular penciling. So it was really hard for me to draw that quickly. And so I ended up, I don't know if you heard this story, but the timing, I just happened to be getting married at the time too. So I had
Right.
to, they were going to give the pencils to someone else to ink. And I said, oh no, it's a graphic novel. You got to let me ink it myself. And they said, well, we got to have it by this date. And I was, getting married, and I said, I'll do it. I'll get it done. But I had to work through my honeymoon, inking the graphic novel,
How did
which
that work
was,
out? She's still with you, right? Just
yeah,
want
we've
to
been
make
married
sure.
now
Okay,
for
good.
many, many years. But it was not that bad because we had rented a place on the beach from a friend of the family. So it was like a month-long honeymoon on the beach, actually, instead of just a few nights in Vegas or something. So I would work, a few hours every day, a lot of hours every day, trying to ink the book. And then we had a good second honeymoon a year later when the royalties came in.
There you go. There you go. So, what was the
But
fan
anyway, let
reception?
me just finish. I ended up leaving the
Okay.
series. In fact, the reason I switched from penciling to inking, uh, I was having to rush through the pencil so much, and the inker on the book was a relatively inexperienced inker as well, Mike Gustovich. And my pencils were so rough, he was having a hard time getting them to look the way I thought the book should look. So I thought maybe I can have more control over the finished look of the book if I start inking. Can you just give me someone to do breakdown pencils, and I'll make it look the way I want to in the inks? And so they put Sal Buscema doing breakdowns, and I took over the inks for a few issues. But Sal, was doing like 2 or 3 books a month at the time, and he's a very good artist, excellent artist. But it wasn't his baby, the way that it was my baby. So he was doing kind of standard stuff, and so different from the way that I would have done it that after a few issues, I just still wasn't happy with the way the book was looking. And I was just figured, I needed to move on to something else where I could have a little more time and do it the way I wanted to do it. So reluctantly, I left the series. And again, at the time, I didn't know it was going to be a huge hit. There was not the big fan base back then that there is now, and the social media where you get an instant response for whatever you do. So, I mean, I knew that it got a good reception, but I still didn't know if it was going to last or fizzle out after 20 issues or so. I didn't know that it was that much of a landmark series that it ended up being, or I would have stayed on the book. I didn't
Right,
know that
right,
I didn't know the royalties were going to be as good as they were, or I would have stayed on the book.
right. With the
Um,
movie and everything.
yeah, well, at the time Chris and I signed that contract for the series, we laughed about it ever becoming a movie. When are they going to make a movie of something like this? They got all these other characters that they're going
Right,
to put into movies first. And at that time in the 80s, there were no Marvel superhero movies. There was a Superman movie out. Um, Maybe the first Batman. I don't even think the first Batman movie had come out. And movies just weren't happening. So it was a joke to us that they put something in our contracts about it if it ever became a movie. Um, so if I had known, sure, I definitely would have stayed on the book.
then Bill Sienkiewicz would have been out of a job and had to stick to Moon Knight.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, Bill, Anna's my baby. These are all my characters. Screw you, do something else and go do another book.
It would have been a very different series if I'd stayed on it, because look how many artists it went through.
Right,
I mean, there was Tom Mandrake and Sal Buscema and
right.
John Bogdanov and Bill Sienkiewicz.
Yeah. And then after Bill, I'm trying to think because I'm trying to think who did it within like the 40 issues because it wasn't Bill then.
Brett Blevins, maybe.
Brett Blevins, maybe, but and then it eventually got to everyone who we know nowadays named Rob Liefeld, and we got that,
Yeah.
but that's a different story. But yeah, this story aged like immaculately well, man. And then another story that you worked on is also going to be aging. But before we get to that, what was the communication process like? Were you guys all in New York? Obviously not in your honeymoon, but did everything kind of go through New York? How did everything work then?
At the time I was living, my inking career had taken off far enough in 1979 that I was able to move out of New York City. Before that, I figured I had to be right there where Marvel and DC were in order to get steady work. But I was getting all the work I could handle by 1979, so I moved back down to Tampa, my hometown, and bought a house. I couldn't afford to buy one in New York, but I could afford one in Tampa. So I bought a house and was living in Tampa and making occasional trips up to New York. Chris and I were talking on the phone a lot, but it was all just communicating by phone. And if I had any questions with the scripts, I would either talk to him on the phone or I'd make a trip up to New York. But his plots were very complete, and he actually always gave me more than I could fit into the comic. I actually had to edit down his plots a little bit. And I said, I can't get this all in. Do you care if I cut some of this stuff out? And he said, no, I'd rather give you too much than too little, and do whatever you
Right.
think it needs to be done. So he was very easy to work with. And we had, no problems communicating. Of course, he would send his script into the editor, Louise Simonson, and then she would send it down to me, and I would do my pencils and send it back to her, and then they would send it to a letterer, and then they would send it back to me or to Mike Gustovich to do the inking. So it's constantly being FedExed all over the country.
Right. And obviously in good condition as well. Did any the pages tear throughout the journey, or are they still in pretty pristine format?
Well, actually, I started around that time, maybe even before then, a couple of years before then. I started making Xerox copies of everything that I did, just in case it got lost in the mail,
Mm.
or damaged in the mail, because some other artists did have that problem. Luckily, none of mine ever were lost or damaged in the mail, and they held up pretty well.
So salute to your postal man, to the people running the USPS at the time.
Yeah, I
Um,
was I was friends with the FedEx guy. You know, he knew who I was, and we always had a little conversation when he came to get the pages.
right. And I wish they can do what they did back in the day because I've lost a few packages in FedEx
Oh,
with
I had a
comic.
FedEx truck one time. I forget what job I was working on, but I wasn't sending pages off. They were, yeah, well, they were about to pick up some pages from me. The guy parked his FedEx truck outside my house and said, "Can I use your phone for a minute?" And I said, "Yeah, what's the matter?" And he said, my truck's overheating." And so I let him in to use the phone. And while he was on the phone to FedEx, his whole front end of his FedEx truck burst into flame. And luckily, I live like a block from the fire department. And so we called the fire. They might even come before we called them because they could see the smoke. And they came and shot the fire hose from the front of the truck straight through to the back, wetting everything in the truck. So I'm really glad my pages were not in there, that he hadn't picked them up yet.
He was using your phone.
Yeah.
um, I kind of had an experience like that. It was the first car I owned. We had to get a new engine for it. I don't know why we didn't just get a new car, but the engine got overheated. It was on like a day where it was like 102 degrees, and I was driving down the highway, and it was kind of where the local lanes and the express lanes would merge. So my car started like steaming up, so I just parked like right in like the merge between the two, kind of like right where the barrier is, right when the barrier ends, was just enough for my car. So I had to I had to get everything out, and I'm like, I'm calling a AAA, I'm calling everyone, and all of a sudden I'm like, and they're like, so what's the current status of your car? And I'm like, well, let me turn around. And it's on fire, you know. I was like, dang, but like I got everything out. I had my shirt, I brought, which is great because I had a few comic books in there. So I was like, I'll grab those first. And I have a twin
Yeah.
brother, so he had like all of his, he had like a couple of his like clothes in there because he used to play basketball. I I got those too, you know. I got his shoes, and later, then now they're mine because I saved them, and he wasn't wearing them anymore. But what was like the fan said the difference between the graphic novels and the single issues? Because like it's kind of weird how they introduced them as a graphic novel and then went to single issues and wanted to go back to the graphic novel.
Well, the graphic novels were supposed to be more illustrative, like a kind of a different look. They were drawn at slightly different size. Um, but like I said, I was rushing so quickly through it. And then as soon as I finished the graphic novel, I had to jump on the first issue and start drawing that right away. Um, so I kind of just was, like I said, I was still learning storytelling and where to put the figures and what angles to show them from and everything. It was just a real learning curve for me on that series. I learned a lot. It was a great experience, and I know a lot of the fans really like my artwork on that series, but
Oh yeah.
I don't think it's some of my best work because I had to do it so quickly.
And it's great to see that it's aged all through the years. Not a lot of creators can say that. Before we do get into Craven, just one more X-Men question. This is the King of X-Men, Chet. He's a we always ask, or he always asks, who's your favorite X-Men character, and he's the one who I told you about backstage, who has almost every single X-Men comic book from Claremont Burn Run signed by Stan and Claremont. So, who is your favorite X-Men? There is a right answer, by the
um,
way.
my favorite X-Men would probably have to be Wolverine.
Okay, you answered correctly. I would have taken Wolverine. Anything that wasn't Cyclops, I would have said that's acceptable. or Professor X, because he wasn't the nicest person when you guys were working on him. He was kind of a douchebag, especially today.
Yeah, well, Wolverine has just got an interesting look and an interesting character. Everything about him is just kind of interesting and fun. Cyclops, I always thought was kind of boring. Professor X,
Yes.
sitting around was not that much
See,
fun to draw.
see, this is why you're on the show today. It's because we can bash Cyclops together. No, I'm just kidding. The biggest reason why I want to talk about Kraven, not because he's going to be in the MCU, I really couldn't care less about all that stuff, but Kraven's Last Hunt was my first Spider-Man story, and to this day, I have not read a Spider-Man story that's topped it. It's also one of the most controversial issues that Marvel's ever had in their comics, and that is how Kraven and took himself out of the game. He ended up pointing the shotgun in his mouth. How did everything go down? Was that intended to do so? Did you guys know going in that there's going to be so much backlash to that storyline?
Well, how old were you when you read it, by the way?
I was probably 16. So when I first started.
I've talked to little people who were like 9 years old, and that was their first comic. It's kind of a very mature storyline.
Right.
I can't imagine it being someone's first Spider-Man comic. But actually, that whole storyline, the writer Mateus originally
Right.
approached DC Comics with it, and he wanted it to be a Batman storyline, and the Batman and the Joker instead of Spider-Man and Kraven. And I think maybe The Killing Joke had just come out,
Yes.
and DC didn't want to do something along those same lines again, so they rejected him. And so then he brought the story over to Marvel. It's a very convoluted, complicated process where it ended up being what it is. You should get Mark DeMatteis to explain it to you sometime.
I would
But
love to have him on the show. I would love to have him on
yeah,
here.
he's a great guy and would be a good guest. He's very fun to talk to. Um, but if Craven was not his first choice. He was going to do something else and was looking around for what villain was available that somebody else wasn't already using, and found out Craven. Nobody was doing anything with Craven. He was kind of not
Right.
a very interesting character up to that
Right.
time.
This story made him that character.
Right. Yeah. Well, that was all Mark DeMatteis working, changing what he had in mind for the Joker and making Craven a strong enough villain to fill those shoes. So he was rewriting that to make it work as a Spider-Man story, and they approached me. Mike and I had worked together a lot in the past. We kind of started in the business at the same time.
Yes.
So I'd inked him a few times before, and he thought my inking would be kind of give it the appropriate atmosphere that he was looking for.
100%.
Um, yeah, so he started out inking that series really super tight pencils, which was unusual for him. His pencils were usually very finished, but just not super tight. So these were
Right.
very detailed, tight pencils at the beginning for he did the first six covers. Uh, I might have inked all of them before I started inking the first issue, and they were really a lot of work. And page rates weren't that high back then, so I was saying, "Wow, this is really a lot of work. I'm not sure I should have taken this job." Um, but
It's
they
only Mike
told us,
Zeck.
yeah. Well, I always enjoyed inking over Mike, so I was still enjoying it. It was just a lot of work. But they told us it was going to take place over all three Spider-Man titles, which
Right,
had
right,
never
right.
been done. And we all thought, "Wow, that's pretty cool. That's pretty special." So we knew it was going to be kind of an event, but we had no idea it would still be talked about as a classic comic, decades later. And he surprisingly, I think he said, did not get a lot of flack from the office about the suicide. Um, so it made a big splash in the fandom and the reaction of the fans. But I think the office, from what I heard, if I remember right, was okay with it.
Right. I think it wasn't until like a few years after it really started to get like, okay, this is suicide. The Comic Code of Authority is like, maybe. Um, but it just like the fact that it actually happened in a comic book and it was set up to where it was almost like relieving for Craven to end his life was very well done, especially for the time when there wasn't a whole lot out of mental illness. It's at that time, it's something that I've studied, and that story was a kind of a big push in understanding people in Craven's situation. Um,
It's
so
so
that was
interesting. It's so interesting how comics, these stories that we did in comics, kind of reflected society or even influenced society around us. When Neil Adams was doing the drug storyline in Green Lantern, Green Arrow in the 60s, and
right
when we did this with the mental illness, when the New Mutants came out with the more multicultural cast, everything seemed to be moving either simultaneously with society or kind of
or
influence.
against it. I would
Yeah,
even say Jim Starlin and Englehart creating Shang-Chi was kind of against it because they didn't want to greenlight that in the first place. And
yeah.
then you had Bob Layton, who was doing the alcoholism storyline with Tony Stark. And it's amazing to see how these kinds of stories that speak to a larger audience not only I would say bring in new readers, but they're ahead of the game, and they're still talked about today because they were so I don't want to say they're ahead of their time, but they were ahead of society, I would say.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at, kind of on the cutting edge there at least.
100%, man. And then you also got to ink Todd McFarlane's first Amazing Spider-Man issue, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah. Actually, I inked Todd on a story before that. Spitfire, I think was the name of the comic, Spitfire and the Troublemakers or something like that. And his pencil, he was a beginning penciler at that time, and his pencils were pretty rough. And so I did this really uh, elaborate ink job on the Spitfire comic where I took over quite a bit, and he liked a lot what I did on it. And then Spider-Man, he was still, his pencils were kind of rough, and he was vouchering them as finished pencils when I considered them breakdowns. They weren't really anything like the pencils everybody's inking today, where it's almost a lot of tracing. The pencils are
Right.
so tight. There's no way you could trace anything that he was doing. And so I really thought he was taking money out of my pocket by vouchering finished pencils, because when I ink breakdowns, I would get more money than when I inked finished pencils. So I wasn't happy having to ink these really rough pencils. And so I didn't put in all of the line work that he later became famous for, because it wasn't necessary and I wasn't getting paid extra to do it. So I kind of simplified his art on those two issues, 298 and 299, I think they were.
Right.
And so actually he didn't like it as much. And
That's
so he wanted to
crazy,
take over
man.
to inking himself. So
I
he
think
started
that's
inking.
I think that's the first time I've ever heard someone talk about McFarlane, because whenever we think of McFarlane, we're like, okay, now he's the one who's inking everyone else. You see one of the hottest names in comics right now, Donny Cates, who just turned in his pencils, who's usually an author, for a variant cover that McFarlane inked for King Spawn. It's crazy to see how McFarlane, starting out, how much he's grown as an artist, but also like a big testament to your inking, because the two issues that I have that I could pull out right now are damn near perfect.
Well, they're good inking. It's just a more simplified ink style than he wanted. But I was at that time. You remember what year that came out? I had little kids. I was raising a family.
88, 88, 89, because it was probably right after Craven. Craven
Yeah,
was
so
87.
my first two kids were born around that time, and I was just busy raising a family and thinking of it more as a job than something fun. I mean, drawing comics is great fun, but it's also a job. And so when I was having to earn less money because it was taking me longer to work on these pages, I wasn't happy. So I was just as
Yeah.
happy to leave the book after he wanted to ink it himself.
Do you guys have a better relationship now, or did you guys kind of like break it off?
I have never talked to Todd in person. A lot of
Oh
times in
no way.
this business, you don't even meet the people you're working
Well,
with because everybody's all over the world. And at the time, I don't know where Todd was living. He might have been California. I'm not sure. And I was down in Florida. So I never met him, never talked to him on the phone. To this day, I've never talked to him.
so Bob McLeod made the Todd file that we know today. The unsung hero. um, but yeah, man, how did you actually enjoy the New Mutants movie that came out? Because
you know,
it was kind of weird how it came out that way.
yeah, it's very bad timing. It happened to be the last movie, or one of the last movies at Fox before Marvel got the franchise back, and that was bad. And then COVID came along, that was bad, and it kept getting delayed. So it was a mess, really, as far as its premiere. And then when I heard it was going to be a horror slant on it, I thought, well, that's weird. But I thought, well, it could also be really interesting if they do it right. That could bring in a whole new audience of horror fans into the superhero movies, and it might do really well. I can't wait to see what they're going to do with it. And then it just kept getting delayed and delayed, and I eventually ended up seeing it. I think my friend of mine sent me a bootleg copy of it, and I watched it before it was released to cable. Um, and it's an entertaining enough movie. I've got problems with it. It's not a great movie. It's not an awful movie. It's just kind of
I would
it was in the middle.
I would like them to kind of redo what they're doing with New Mutants. I think now that Marvel has that title and they're doing a lot more with their animation, I think What If is a great experiment to see how their animation is able to retain with the audience, right? Because it's not just comic book people that you have to like kind of introduce it to, because we know all of these people we're seeing. Like we know Thor, we know Spider-Man, we know Hulk, we even know Nebula isn't who Nebula is, or Mantis isn't who Mantis really is in the comics. But I think New Mutants would be a great animation to kind of get that newer audience for X-Men being in the Marvel universe. I think that would be a great animated show.
Yeah, I agree. If I had done it, um, because everybody knows who Spider-Man is around the world, right? Nobody knew who the New Mutants were except
Right,
a few hundred comics fans, maybe a few thousand comics fans. So they needed an origin story more than a horror story.
right,
Um,
100%.
and he did kind of introduce the characters, but not really, so that we got to know them as individuals and what
Right,
their strengths were and everything the way I think it would have been better to do it. I mean, in a lot of ways, the graphic novel would have been a fine movie.
right.
Um,
Oh, I
but
think so.
yeah, I just think they needed more of an introduction to the world instead of jumping in as a horror movie.
Right.
Um, but
I don't think they had a great budget for that movie anyway, so I think that influenced why they kind of went to that horror route. I think if they had a larger budget, they could have done a better cast across multiple settings.
yeah,
But they were usually in that like one house for like the majority of the movie, which is a little weird. Before we head out with the show, I want to take a moment just to let people know where you are. What are you up to? Or are you attending any cons? Are you doing commissions?
yeah. I have been. I just started going to conventions again in August. I hadn't been to one since the start of COVID, but things seem to have been getting better when I agreed to go to some conventions. And then right after I got my plane tickets and hotel rooms, of course, COVID made a turn for the worst, and this variant came along, and everything was heating up, especially in Florida, which is where my first convention was. It was MegaCon Orlando. and it was a mess down there in the state. But everyone was masked in the convention, and it turned out fine. Um, and like I said, I'm vaccinated, so I felt relatively safe. So I've been doing a couple conventions. I just did a show in Dallas, and I'm going to be going to the Baltimore Con in October, and that's one of my favorite shows. So I'm looking forward to that.
Baltimore is the best show for anyone who has not been to Baltimore. Not only is it the best because it's in my home state, but you get a great cast of creators, both from the Bronze Age, a little bit of the Silver Age, 90s, and current. So, and it's not all a lot of content here about, well, who's the biggest movie star you can bring in? This is honestly one of the biggest true to heart Comic Cons. Like it's a fan show. It's like you're here for the comics, 100%.
Yeah, it's a comic book convention, much more than a multimedia convention, the way so many shows are now, and that's great. It makes it really fun.
Right. And I know if you guys are going to be at Baltimore, you're going to say hi to me. You're going to say hi to Bob. Definitely know that you guys saw the interview here if you're at Baltimore. Bob, thank you so much for coming on the show, my friend. You are welcome back anytime. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks very much. It was fun. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Into the chat, thank you guys for being here. This show is 100% a reflection of your support of this channel. It's how we're able to keep doing this. The next guest, you guys might know them from Adventure Man. It is the Adventure Man team of Matt Fraction and Terry Dodson making their return for season 2. And then after that, we have Dan Watters and Danny, who are doing the Arkham City book coming out in October. Guys, Creators Corner is stacked. I can officially say it is stacked until January. It is fully booked. At least 2 creators a month. So definitely make sure you guys are tuned in, because one of these days you're going to see your favorite creator on this channel. And it's an absolute pleasure to do so. Bob, thank you so much again. And guys, we will see you guys next time.
All right.